But climate change is different because we have an expiration date. And the IPCC report says we've got 12 years to turn it around. 12 years. So my concern is that we are going to be the frog in the pot of boiling water. And we are going to debate and debate and debate and debate and debate. And then when we actually finally pass something, it is a wimpy carbon tax and our kids are doomed.
It is in this one example where the more data you examine, the more anti-science you are. And in this example, not believing in a world-ending global power which controls the future is the actual conspiracy theory. It may be best to distance myself and say that this video is pure skepticism, but in fact, it is my skepticism. There are real problems I have with what has apparently become mainstream consensus. This video can't cover them all, but it can provide some hard figures, solutions, and reasons for them. You may have heard of the impending climate change disaster, that the world would end in as soon as 12 years.
And so if we are going to confront any of these challenges, whether it's challenges to the economy, or a system of healthcare, or public education, or confronting climate change before it is too late within the 10 years that we have left to us to act, then the single greatest mechanism that humankind has ever devised to call forth the power of the people, a democracy, must be fixed.
We talk about the concern of the environment as an elitist concern. 1 year ago, I was waitressing in a taco shop in downtown Manhattan. I just got health insurance for the first time a month ago.
We've heard that global warming and the climate change catastrophe will end civilization as we know it. As of April 1st, get it? April Fool's Day. Canadians will be paying a federal carbon tax. Canada is 40% forest and has 10% of the world's forest cover. Yet, apparently this population has to pay to solve a global problem allegedly caused by people born long before us, in countries far, far away. For comparison, Canada has the same land area as the United States, which has 10 times as many people. Europe has the same land area as Canada and the United States, yet has 20 times the Canadian population. China is the same size as Canada, Europe, and the United States, yet has 40 times the population, living and polluting the same land space with fewer forests or concerns for them. But the best way to combat climate change certainly isn't taxing people, and the most effective methods may not be in reducing the human output of carbon emissions at all. The senior research scientist with Natural Resources Canada, Dr. Werner Kurz, was interviewed by the CBC, where he said that the 2017 wildfires in British Columbia released around 150 million tons of CO2, which is 2 or 3 times higher than man-made emissions. Similar fires happen year after year here in British Columbia, in California, and Australia, all around the world. They happen endlessly, destroying resources, undoing all the carbon absorption and oxygen creation they've done in their lifetimes, returning to the dust from whence they came. Further devastating Canadian forests, thereby releasing vast amounts of carbon dioxide, are the mountain pine beetles, which have infested our forests. I said as a child that the solution to the pine beetle was to clear cut and replant affected areas. By clear cut, I mean strip by strip, year by year, to systematically harvest a complete area, while replanting behind, possibly even transplanting some portion of trees to get a head start. Change species if necessary, or develop stronger trees. To my understanding, younger trees are the least likely affected anyway. Taking quick and thorough action would have limited the spread of the epidemic, provided a brief boost to the economy, and prevented more carbon emissions than years, possibly decades, of carbon taxes ever would, all while providing useful resources and speeding the recovery of the future forests. Instead, our forests were allowed to be devoured, left dry and dead in the beetles' wake while they multiplied like a plague and continued to spread over the vast mountain ranges of British Columbia and Alberta, down through Washington State and into Oregon, down along the entire boreal western coast, and even up into Alaska. As you can see, not only do the dead trees stop consuming carbon dioxide, they start producing it, but they also take up the physical space needed to allow healthy flora to thrive. Over half of the pine trees have been killed by the infestation, and the beetles have adapted to consume jack pine, which is even more common. Yet even as we constrain human activity, the forests continue to be squandered, literally left as food for the worms to eventually go up in smoke. And what steps does the government take to combat this scourge? They further reduce the harvest allowance. Quote, "While the near-term outlook for the industry is bright, over the medium term the aggregate size of BC's forest industry will contract due to immediate reductions in the annual allowable cut. By 2016, the mountain pine beetle infestation in the interior is projected to have harmed or destroyed 58% of the harvestable lodgepole pine in the province. As a result, the total annual allowable cut will decline by 20% from historical norms. This reduction in timber supply will result in high fiber costs as sawmill, panel, pulp and paper, wood pellet, and bioenergy operations compete for a diminished supply of timber, and some communities in the interior are buffeted by consolidation and closure of certain facilities. On the upside, however, a strong pricing environment and low Canadian dollar should help to keep BC operations profitable and limit the job losses associated with a smaller annual allowable cut. What a brilliant observation from the same geniuses who restrict harvest in reaction to an epidemic outbreak. If production lowers, prices will rise. Simple supply and demand, right? Leave it to a socialist to think he can get paid the same amount by doing less work. And this is despite projections that forest fires will escalate exponentially in the future.
McMurray, a climate change wildfire action draft plan was released by the BC Ministry of Forests that predicted the average size of a wildfire would go from roughly 8,000 hectares up to around 19,000. This begs the question, has the new era of the mega fire been ushered in? And how much blame for these extreme wildfire events be pinned on climate change?
The Fort McMurray fire was a terrible event and really is one of the most extreme cases we've seen of one of these springtime fires. However, we can't say that all of a sudden climate change has made individual fires like this happen. What climate change does is it essentially loads the dice. It changes the odds of getting certain types of events. Fires need a lot of fuel that's dry, and you need hot, dry, windy conditions. It's likely that in the case of Fort McMurray, think about, two dice, and what happened there is we essentially loaded the dice so that it was a bigger odd when we rolled them that we got a fire situation where the fire could explode. Did climate change cause this fire? Absolutely not. Does it make fires like this more likely in the future? Yes, it does.
Experts say one solution could be to reduce fuel loads in the forest before they explode. For the Weather Network, I'm Nathan Coleman.
Yet the very studies which the government is using to project this smoky, carbon-filled future ignores the beetle epidemic affecting more than 50% of the forests, using climate change as a catch-all for any increased rate in forest fires. Quote this Global News article, "The model did not account for changes in forest management or human ignition sources, nor did it directly weigh the impacts from pine beetle infestations or repeated suppression over time, which the authors say could result in larger fires." And it's not simply this study. From Carleton University, Ontario, it appears that this answer is being pursued in lieu of all others. Quote, "Possible causes have focused primarily on climate change-induced stress in trees, rendering them more susceptible to attack, as well as lower winter mortality in the larval stages of the beetle. Temperature influences everything in a beetle's life, from the number of eggs laid by a single female beetle to the beetle's ability to disperse to new host trees, to individuals' overwinter survival and development timing. For winter mortality to be a significant factor, sufficiently cold temperatures around -30 Fahrenheit must persist for up to a week while the beetles are at their most vulnerable stages. But due to global climate change, winter temperatures are not falling as low or lasting as long as is necessary to be an effective check on the bark beetle population. Have temperatures ever fallen consistently below a minus 30 Fahrenheit in the state of Washington? Records from the past 100 years show peaks which, aren't all that impressive, but suggest that maybe it's possible. In Kamloops, British Columbia, firmly in the affected zone, the mean January temperature was 27 degrees Fahrenheit, and the record single low was minus 37 Fahrenheit, recorded in the 1950s. Spokane, Washington, also firmly in the affected zone, has a winter average somewhere in the mid-20s. That's positive 20s. These temperatures are far off the consistent minus 30, which is required to significantly damage the beetle infestation, and could not possibly be due to global warming and the 1 or 2 or 3 degrees which are attributed to it. This explanation of climate as the primary factor in the beetles ignores the fact that creatures like this often evolve rapidly. For example, since the 1950s, the Colorado potato beetle has evolved a resistance to 56 different chemical insecticides. Once they've done so, they can rapidly exploit a new or more hostile biome.
That's happening here in the United States too. You've heard of the pine beetle problem. Those pine beetles used to be killed by the cold winters, but there are fewer days of frost, and so the pine trees are being devastated. This is part of 14 million acres of spruce trees in Alaska that have been killed by bark beetles, the exact same phenomenon. There are cities that were founded because they were just above the mosquito line. Nairobi is one, Harare is another. There are plenty of others. Now the mosquitoes, with warming, are climbing to higher altitudes.
Indeed, the beetle has evolved during our story to begin consuming other types of pine trees. And in fact, they say that the dead trees left in the wake of the pine beetles aren't even responsible for the fires, except for when they are. Carleton University continues. The bark beetle can play an important regulatory role in forest ecosystems. Normally, these insects attack old or weakened trees, speeding development of a younger forest. Creating a younger forest is in fact something I'm arguing for in this video. But their role in increasing fire activity is largely unfounded. Well, count me wrong, eh? It could be assumed that all the trees the beetles are killing would provide more than ample fuel for a fire. This is only true immediately after the trees die, while it still has its needles, or after the tree has fallen down. Apparently they don't burn anywhere in between. Outbreaks of the mountain pine beetle do not appear to substantially increase the risk of a subsequent fire under most conditions. Instead, fire risk is strongly tied to warm and dry conditions, such as those of recent decades. As long as the severe droughts we have been seeing in recent years persists, we can expect a high risk of fire, regardless of beetle outbreaks. Black and Noon, 2013. Well, that's it then. If there's an eternal drought, beetles aren't really a problem.
Huge infestation here, and we simply cannot escape it.
The mountain pine beetle has taken over Jasper.
The adult beetle will bore into adult pine trees, lay their eggs, and then the young will effectively girdle the pine tree, which kills the pine tree.
The forest pest came over to the national park from BC and spread quickly.
For the last 4 or 5 years, it's been approximately doubling in the area impacted in Jasper.
At last count in 2017, 93,000 hectares had been impacted. That's nearly half of all the pine trees susceptible to the beetle in the park. The dead trees act like kindling.
The risk of fire right now is the paramount concern.
Firefighters and volunteers in the town are training for a wildfire.
We bought a trailer with a bunch of hoses and sprinklers so those can be set out around town to help combat fire.
Residents are being asked to fire smart their homes, pack an emergency kit, and know the evacuation routes.
There are 3 valleys out of town, so we can go east, west, or south, and that's the limit of it.
Parks Canada is helping too. A community fire guard has been established above the town, and prescribed burns and selective cuts are taking out some of the dead trees. But there's too many to remove them all.
The fact that they're now red and dead because of the pine beetle, like I said, that just extends the season that we may see ourselves in high or extreme fire danger. It means we'll have fire bans in place more frequently.
But remember what I said about expecting to get paid the same for doing less work? Well, if global market conditions are right, you can do exactly that. De Beers, Anglo-American Platinum, and George Soros's Quantum Fund all use this principle to get more for giving less. And it seems that this has worked to some extent for the Canadian wood industries. Indeed, they output less and earn more by a slight margin. Mostly, it's simply stagnation. There are no radical plans ahead, however, to counter the spreading scourge devouring our carnivorous. Only bankers' projections and political grift. But even if climate change were the primary factor in the growth of the beetle infestation, the solution is certainly not reducing the logging harvest and imposing carbon taxes. And while we've done so, Canada and British Columbia's once booming logging industry have fallen to the wayside. The machinery and infrastructure go to waste, the skilled laborers age and retire without training replacement, secondary manufacturing either closes or never opens. That housing crisis we're supposed to be addressing sure would be easier with cheaper lumber. Replanting trees was a common trade of youth and vagabonds, and the logging and milling an income for middle-class family men. In fact, I believe that those manufacturing jobs are the solution to global warming, and that tree-hugging environmentalists are as much of an impact on the environment as some of the most polluting industries. Now let's play a video in the background. This is a NASA satellite-based simulation of the concentration of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere over time. Put my arguments aside and simply ponder what it means. In the meanwhile, let's continue. Carbon sequestration is a natural process driven by photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide is absorbed from the air and converted to oxygen. The carbon becomes part of the plant structure. Allowing the plant to burn or rot is a reversal of that entire process.
Hey guys, I have the good use of the words unspuzzle. My lungs unspuzzle the air from the earth as I can breathe it. Period.
Well, I don't see the humor in any of it.
Increased carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere drive plant growth. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, increased CO2 levels have increased plant growth by up to 30%. The New York Times has also reported on this phenomena, citing a 31% increase according to a Nature publication, amounting to 28 billion tons of carbon absorption. And as CO2 levels and perhaps temperatures increase, so too will growing zones. Hydroponic growers continue to see results at carbon dioxide levels far higher than the current 400 parts per million. However, yet another New York Times article argues, global greening sounds good. In the long run, it's terrible. Here we see figures that humans emit 40 billion tons of CO2 per year, which isn't all that much more than the 28 billion extra absorbed by the excess plant growth. The article says, quote, a number of small studies have suggested that humans actually are contributing to an increase in photosynthesis across the globe. That's a funny attempt to downplay whilst declaring others science deniers. The bulk of the article's argument focuses on food production, as if it were at all relevant. What they absolutely fail to address is my central point. Increased plant growth means nothing if you don't harvest the material. if you allow it to return to the carbon cycle, a significant portion will again become carbon dioxide. This boom of plant growth gives us everything we need to reduce global carbon levels, if only we'd actually utilize that carbon. As Canadian publication The National Observer writes, few people are aware that British Columbia's beaten-up forests are now releasing more planet-warming carbon dioxide than all other provincial sectors combined, or that these forest emissions are not counted as part of the total in provincial greenhouse gas inventories. These massive and growing forest emissions are a result of destructive logging, beetle outbreaks, and wildfires. BC's forests stopped absorbing more carbon than they release in the early 2000s. For the sake of time, we won't question whether the climate change ideology's data collection sites are representative, or if their historic estimates are accurate, and if their future projections are at all conclusive. Carbon dioxide is heavier than oxygen and nitrogen after all, and has a far higher concentration closer to ground level. Climate change scientists are surely aware of this fact and take it into account in every model, surely. So, without questioning the one true God of climate science, there are still practical, effective, and even beneficial actions we can take to alleviate the proliferation of CO2. Or, we can use hysteria to manufacture consent to tax the public and increase government control of individual and corporate capital.
We need to innovate on our technology.
Right.
Obviously, like I had a staffer, release a document that talked about cow flatulence, but
which is an issue. I just want to say,
it
sounds ridiculous, but it literally is an issue.
But it actually is an issue when it comes to contributing to methane.
Right.
But that doesn't mean you end cows. It means that we need. What it means is that we need to innovate and change our grain, our cow grain from which they feed in these troughs. That we need to really take a look at regenerative agriculture. Like, these are our solutions.
Right.
These are our solutions.